I wanted to welcome everybody today. My name is Siobhan Carroll. I'm Intraprise Health's Head of Marketing, and I'll be your host this afternoon. Thanks everybody for joining us. Today's webinar will focus on security risk assessments and how organizations can make the most of them. The webinar itself will take about 45 minutes, leaving 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A. I'd like to start by giving you a couple of quick webinar tips. Throughout the webinar, we'll keep all lines muted to prevent background sounds. If you need to get in touch with me, please use the chat feature, which is along the bottom of your screen. Send your any technical difficulties to me. I'll be listed as a host. And if you have questions that you'd like the presenters to address, please chat them to me whenever you think of them. We'll answer them at the end of the presentation. After today's session, you'll receive an email from us. If you're interested in a copy of the slides, just let us know. And I think that's all the tips I have. So let me give you a little bit of information on Intraprise Health. We're an award-winning healthcare-focused cybersecurity firm. We're also a certified high-trust assessor with extensive experience with the NIST framework. We provide products and services to assess, remediate, and monitor cybersecurity risk, regulatory compliance programs, organizational resilience, and third-party risk management. With that, I would like to introduce our presenters. Ian Terry is one of Intraprise Health's esteemed healthcare security consultants. Ian is a healthcare IT security and privacy expert who previously worked with Jefferson Health System. Ian's a graduate of the National Center of Academic Excellence in Cybersecurity as recognized by the NSA and DHS. Harrison Welch is another security rock star on our team. Harrison is an IT risk management, privacy, and security consultant with experience in both public and private sector firms. Harrison's focused on implementing information security programs involving security, privacy, and insider threat. With that, I will let Harrison and Ian take it away.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. This is Ian Terry speaking. To get everyone started off, I'm going to cover today's agenda, a brief overview of some of the topics we'll cover. We'll start out by providing an overview of security risk assessments, or SRA. I'll talk about the key components that consist of an effective SRA process. Then we'll talk about a new concept we're introducing to everyone today called focus security risk assessments, how to focus your SRAs to crisis situations, and we'll actually talk about a specific case study to exemplify that process. Finally, we'll talk about 3 ways to improve upon your standard SRA process and take it to the next level. And with that, I will hand it off to Harrison to get us started talking about security risk assessments.
Thanks, Ian. If you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. Since 2009, we've seen a steady increase in year after year healthcare data breaches totaling over 3,000, involving about 500 or more patient records. Those breaches have resulted in the disclosure of over 231 million healthcare records, which is a lot. One way to address this issue is to reduce the likelihood of a breach occurring is by being proactive and taking the time to perform comprehensive security risk assessments. This assessment will look at your organization's overall cybersecurity posture to help identify areas of risk. By prioritizing the safety of your sensitive information assets and patient PHI data through periodic security risk assessments, you can fine-tune your cybersecurity defenses and reduce the likelihood of suffering a devastating data breach. Today, we'll briefly discuss what a security risk assessment is, how your organization can perform targeted or focused security risk assessments, and how you can take your existing security risk assessment process to the next level. So a little trip down memory lane. Back in 1996, Congress passed the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, which we all know as HIPAA. This regulation established standards for privacy and security of protected health information and is really the basis of much of the healthcare security industry today. The HIPAA security rule requires that all organizations conduct an accurate and thorough assessment of the potential risks and vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of electronic protected health information held by covered entities or also held by business associates. So it's important to note that much of what we discuss here today all comes back to protecting and ensuring the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of sensitive information assets. But here's the problem. It can be challenging really to understand and make sense of this requirement. It comes across extremely vague and doesn't really tell you what needs to be tested, when, or how often. HIPAA does not really provide instructions on how to go about performing an assessment. In a nutshell, a security risk assessment, or SRA for short, is an exercise conducted internally by an organization or in cooperation with a third-party assessor in order to assess the organization's overall security posture as it relates to its protection of HIPAA information. SRAs are a vital component to an accurate, robust, and compliant risk management program. They also help to look under the hood of the organization's security program. Now, there are three core components of a security program, which we'll talk about today. First is governance, which includes policies and procedures to help guide employees. Second involves controls, including physical, technical, and business controls. These controls help enforce the security requirements defined in policy. Third is compliance, which includes evaluating the entire security posture against regulatory requirements or an industry-leading framework. Conducting SRAs help to identify vulnerabilities and determine their risk. Throughout this process, organizations should continue to ask themselves, how much risk does this vulnerability present? So performing an SRA is definitely the right thing to do for both the patient and for the business. Every organization that holds PHI or ePHI should root out areas where there is risk. It's all about protecting patient information, patient safety, and ensuring patients have the best care available. It tells you what you need to do to be compliant with regulations as well. Performing an SRA helps to provide insight and help all members throughout your organization better understand business operations. And also, establishing a formal security risk assessment program also provides an efficient means for communicating assessment findings and recommending actions to business unit managers as well as senior corporate officials. Performing an SRA also helps to establish a starting point for organizations to know where to focus their attention and understand what is needed to advance protection of sensitive information. Performing an SRA also helps to create a security roadmap to help prioritize and continuously address security risks. Conducting periodic SRAs will help to ensure that your organization is compliant with HIPAA administrative, physical, and technical controls. So we'll come back to that many times today, those different administrative, physical, and technical controls. But now I'll pass it over to Ian to talk about focused security risk assessments.
Right, so Harrison provided a very good high-level overview of the conventional security risk assessment process. But today, we're going to delve into a particular subject we're excited to present that we're calling focused security risk assessments, a special application of the SRA process which provides a targeted analysis in specific situations. So a focused security risk assessment, or FSRA, is really an assessment of a specific component of an organization's scope. That might be a specific process, technology, or even an event that has occurred previously that will be evaluated after the fact. Ultimately, it seeks to derive this deeper understanding of that component's security posture, examining, of course, still examining those key SRA targets, including administrative, physical, and technical controls. However, the benefit of performing an FSRA against a smaller component, a reduced scope of an SRA activity, allows the organization to have an expedited turnaround, which ultimately supports faster, informed decision-making, which makes it an effective mechanism for conducting a deep dive, but achieving faster completion and faster results when they're most needed. So I have a couple examples here of when and where they're best applied. What are the best circumstances or components of your organization to which to apply an FSRA? So a couple examples include crisis situations where business continuity and disaster recovery planning, policies, procedures, or even the technical infrastructure that underpin those processes are evaluated in the wake of a crisis situation. To understand where shortfalls may have occurred or where components of that program were out of compliance. That same principle really applies to a security incident or breach, where incident response plans or breach notification processes can be evaluated, as well as a root cause analysis on the incident itself. Of course, this is also applicable to new or altered technology that affects business processes, policies, or may affect the efficacy of existing security controls. Anytime there is a change in operational normalcy to the business is a great candidate for applying an FSRA, because it gives that organization the ability to take advantage of lessened scope and lessened operational overhead to quickly identify risks, remediation strategies, and understand vulnerabilities inherent to any change, that change in operational normalcy. So I have here illustrated a timeline that is currently common to many organizations that utilize a vulnerability management program. Here we have their initial annual security risk assessment that's performed, and they experience a little later on that change in operational normalcy. The issue is that they end up operating in the wake of that change in operational normalcy without having the ability to understand those security implications of that change until that next annual security risk assessment comes around. Obviously, that presents a great issue to the organization, and that many security incidents can occur in that period. If we jump back and completed an FSRA exercise directly after that change, we'd be able to implement remediation strategies in the short term and wouldn't have to wait until that next annual SRA before we were able to address those issues and achieve compliance. So I mentioned we're going to delve into a specific case study to exemplify how a FSRA can be effective and offer a lot of value to an organization, and also talk about exactly how one would approach this FSRA, specifically to the transition of a lot of our working environments to remote work, remote access environments as a result of the coronavirus crisis. Because this issue is experienced by everybody and is such an emergent and sudden alteration in how we operate, it certainly represents that change in operational normalcy. And because of these changes, it presents that challenge for maintaining CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of business services and EPHI, which ultimately affects our ability to be compliant with HIPAA and other regulatory requirements to which we are subjected, which makes it really a perfect target for an FSRA exercise. And we'll be delving into exactly how one could approach the coronavirus situation and its effect on remote work by engaging in an FSRA. So because remote work occurs in this decentralized manner, we see that a lot of the key integral components, the workforce members themselves really are maneuvered outside of the security perimeter of the organization. And there are specific unique challenges, security challenges presented to those workforce members over which the organization has reduced control and reduced influence. The ultimate goal of the organization should be to rein in that workforce by implementing administrative, physical, and technical controls that reduce the likelihood of a security incident recurring and expand the scope of that organization's security perimeter. Now, those administrative, physical, and technical controls are exactly the components of your security program that fall into scope when performing this focused security risk assessment exercise. And we'll be talking exactly what one will evaluate during that FSRA as it relates to looking at those three categories of control.
So the first set of controls that we're going to look about today are administrative controls. When thinking about administrative controls in the context of remote work, it's important to consider establishing certain organizational policies which help guide employees. Policies include examples such as an acceptable use policy, or an AUP. An AUP outlines the requirements and implementation tasks to ensure that organizational IT-related systems are used for business purposes only. Another example of a policy which could be implemented is a telecommuting policy. The intent of this policy is to address the related security considerations to provide an acceptable level of risk for data as it's transmitted into and out of private networks via remote access connections. Security standards for remote access must be implemented in order to maintain that confidentiality, integrity, and availability of such resources. Now, your organization can evaluate an employee's remote workspace by requiring employees to complete remote security checklists and by having them sign an AUP. The security checklist will help ensure that the proper security protections are in place. Implementing administrative controls will help ensure that your organization's employees are informed and acknowledge their responsibility for protecting sensitive information. It's also important to evaluate physical controls to ensure that controls which are specified in policy and process are implemented. There are various physical controls to consider when evaluating the physical security of an employee's home workspace. For example, is the employee working in view of other residents, or is the employee working in a secluded office space? If the employee is working in view of other residents, does the employee's device have a built-in or removable privacy screen? Are laptops or other organizational devices stored securely when not in use? Are they stored in a locked cabinet or even a locked drawer? Thirdly, are organizational devices shared with other residents? Do other family members or residents utilize the device for personal reasons? And lastly, are employees restricted from connecting to external devices such as printers or fax machines? If the employee is not restricted from printing, is the employee required to use shred bins, for example, to dispose of paper-based PHI? For remote working situations, these lines really begin to blur as responsibility is decentralized throughout a network of remote workers. A proactive organization should evaluate the physical safeguards of their employees' remote workspace to ensure that all their bases are covered. So now I'll pass it back to Ian to discuss the last category, which is technical controls.
Right. So obviously the technical infrastructure of an organization really represents the backbone of much of this remote work that's occurring during the coronavirus crisis, because it facilitates those workforce members access to internal services, resources, and data via remote access solutions. And ultimately, those remote access solutions and other components will fall into scope of the FSRA activity, and we'll be evaluating the configurations and security controls that affect them. First, we'll want to look at how users are connecting to those internal services and resources. I mentioned remote access solutions are really that primary method, and those could consist of VPNs on endpoint clients that provide access to our internal VPN, or more commonly in recent years, the utilization of virtualized connections or virtualized environments, something like VMware Horizon, to facilitate that remote work and that remote access. Thirdly, of course, in some cases, our workforce members will connect directly to resources available and hosted in a cloud setting via a web application or web service. We want to look at all of those connections or those remote access solutions and ensure the following controls are in place. First of all, pretty obviously, encryption for all of that transmission between the endpoint and that service should be in place, especially if we'll be transmitting, receiving, or processing PHI. Next, we'll want to consider access control for those applications, as well as the services that they are accessing once they get to our internal network via the VPN or the virtualized environment. Specifically, we want to consider if we're taking advantage of our existing identity management platform or our Windows Active Directory environment group policy and are able to impose those restrictions and security controls on those connecting users to ensure that they're only able to access the services to which they are entitled, despite the unique and different remote access medium they're using. Thirdly, we want to consider implementing a multi-factor authentication solution. And I would say that remote access environments and remote access is probably one of the first areas where organizations consider implementing that extra level of security, that multi-factor authentication. And surely it prevents a great deal of value to the organizations just as a result of the challenges inherent to authenticating users in this remote working setting. Another good example would just be ensuring we are able to impose Wi-Fi requirements on those workforce members, since they'll be using their home routers or public Wi-Fis in a lot of instances. One example would be encouraging the use of WPA2 encryption rather than WEP. Another thing we want to consider is the endpoints actually being utilized. There are two scenarios really. Either the workforce member is using their own device to connect to our resources, an employee-owned laptop or a home computer. In those instances, our organization has reduced control over how the security configurations exist on that device. So we'll need to consider strategies or use policy to require workforce members to use antivirus or screen timeouts or other controls that we're usually able to impose on employees when they're in our internal environment. The second scenario really being the use of company-owned laptops that we distribute to our workforce members. And even though at first blush that seems like a more secure environment, and we certainly have more control over those devices, there are still unique challenges to consider during a migration to this remote workforce environment. Challenges such as device authentication, or how exactly we're going to approach patch management for those devices that are now disparate and separated from our internal network. Finally, we want to consider availability of our resources to support the remote access. In some circumstances, the actual performance claims made about the firewalls or technical components that support remote access don't actually jive with its actual application. I know firsthand of a situation where a organization's remote access connections were crippled just because so many users were doing complex operations over that remote access connection rather than just statically being connected and not really utilizing a lot of bandwidth and resources. Lastly, I want to do a quick discussion on education and awareness, which really represents the best avenue of deployment for all of these controls. It's something we'll want to evaluate. How can we improve upon our education program and our awareness program to compensate for this change in operational normalcy? There are a lot of different external and internal information sources we can leverage, things like company-specific materials, government channels or news articles, and even recently an FBI alert that was published specifically for teleworkers being targeted during the COVID-19 situation. And really ascertaining a strategy for communicating that information to our workforce members via emails, bulletins and announcements on something like Microsoft Teams or Slack, or assigned learning modules on an education platform like KnowBe4. Ultimately, out of all the controls you can implement, this is one that you can do immediately, and it's cheap, it's fast, and it's effective.
Now we'll discuss 3 unique ways to improve your existing security risk assessment process. All 3 ways discussed in this section are concepts that can be incorporated into your overall SRA process as well as into a focused SRA. These 3 ways are by utilizing frameworks, complementing your assessment with a quantitative approach, and performing a holistic assessment which looks at all aspects of the organization from administrative to technical. As stated, the first method is to take your SRA to the next level is to utilize a framework. Some frameworks are publicly available to be used as a tool for organizations to perform their own security risk assessments. Others require an accredited third body to perform the assessment on behalf of the organization. Organizations should consider utilizing an industry-leading framework to help guide in performing, scoping, and focusing your security risk assessment. Each organization is different, so the decision as to what framework should be used depends largely on the specific organization itself. Each framework has its own unique benefits. There are various options to choose from, and today we will focus and analyze 5 different industry-leading frameworks provided by NIST, ISO, and HITRUST. The first extremely popular framework utilized by many organizations is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, version 1.1. This framework provides a flexible and risk-based implementation that can be used with a broad array of cybersecurity risk management processes. This framework breaks the processes up into 5 categories, which most of us know, which is identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Recently, NIST also released their privacy framework. With a growing concern surrounding individual and privacy rights, NIST developed this framework to help address privacy risk. The framework aims to consider privacy events as potential problems individuals could experience arising from systems, products, or service operations with data, whether in digital or non-digital form, throughout its complete life cycle from data collection through disposal. Similar to NIST CSF, the privacy framework is segmented into 5 categories, but these focus on how the individual's privacy rights are secured. A third framework released by NIST is the NIST Risk Management Framework, or RMF. This framework provides a process that integrates security and risk management activities into the SDLC process. Unlike the CSF and the privacy framework, the risk management framework focuses on selecting the appropriate security controls for a system. Unlike the 3 previous frameworks, these 2 frameworks here require an accredited an accredited body to formally conduct an assessment on behalf of the organization. The High Trust Cybersecurity Framework is a certifiable framework that provides organizations with a comprehensive, flexible, and efficient approach to regulatory compliance and risk management. This framework is special because it leverages nationally and internationally accepted security and privacy-related regulations, standards, and frameworks, including ISO, NIST, PCI, HIPAA, and even COVID. The CSF standardizes these requirements to provide clarity and consistency and reducing the burden of compliance. Depending on the scope of your organization, becoming High Trust certified can be a long and complex process. The framework really looks at all aspects of the organization's security posture. The last framework is the ISO 27001 or 27001 framework. This focuses on requirements for building, monitoring, and improving an information security management system, or ISMS. The goal of this framework is to help build businesses of all sizes in any sector keep information assets secure. This is a systematic approach considering people, process, and technology. The framework focuses on specifications for protecting, once again, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information within an ISMS. This framework also covers various domains to ensure that all aspects of the organization's security posture are covered. So now I'll pass it on to Ian to discuss how you can complement your security risk assessment by utilizing a quantitative approach.
Right. So for most organizations, most information security, privacy, and compliance teams, they're already conducting security risk assessments with a largely qualitative approach, which allows them to use a lot of discretion and makes the entire SRA process a lot more manageable. We posit that a second way to improve your SRA process is to complement that qualitative approach with a quantitative one to achieve a semi-quantitative SRA process. And when I say quantitative, I'm speaking specifically to the use of numerical representations of findings or number-based rating systems for identifying the severity, potential, or impact of vulnerabilities and risks identified during the SRA process. By leveraging this approach, you're able to take advantage of repeatable measurements, create reliable trends in comparison, and though it offers a little bit less discretion in some regards, it's still flexible and manageable. The way that one would implement this is leveraging scoring systems, using an existing explanation of findings and mitigating controls, associating remediation with those findings, and leveraging all of those components to create projections and support goal setting. One of the best ways to implement that quantitative approach is to take advantage of existing and standardized scoring and tiering systems, of which I have 2 exemplified here. The first one, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS, uses a variety of different parameters to assign a severity value to a finding, that severity value ranging from 1 to 10. If you're a technical information security professional, you're probably already familiar with the system because it's inherent to many technical vulnerability scanners by default. For example, Nessus leverages CVSS for all of its findings when you run it on your network. What people may not realize is you can apply the CVSS scoring system to any type of vulnerability, be that an administrative, physical, or technical finding. First, the organization that created the CVSS offers a scoring calculator online, which allows you to put in a bunch of different information, parameters, and attributes about your findings, and it will spit back at you a score, and it makes it very easy to implement that CVSS into your SRA. Another good example, Harrison already talked about the NIST cybersecurity framework. The CSF also implements what are called implementation tiers, which is a number-based system that rates an organization's maturity level with respect to complying with the controls, categories, and subcategories the NIST CSF consists of, which is a great way for ranking your organization and for projecting and supporting goal settings. You can understand exactly what effort will be needed in order to go from a tier 2 organization to a tier 1 organization, for example. Of course, leveraging quantitative data is a great way to support trend analysis for your SRA on an annual basis or a semi-monthly, however often you perform that SRA process, using that historical data in the form of charts, heat maps, or even live dashboards, taking advantage of a technology you may already have, such as Power BI, and integrating it with Microsoft Excel. You can visualize all of this data, which makes it a lot more manageable and tangible as for how your SRA is impacting the security of your organization. Some example variables we have here is severity by location, which allows one to remediate based on the facility, a clinical location, hospital wing, as you perform your SRA. Another one, volume by system, which systems are experiencing the most vulnerabilities. And finally, top 10 vulnerabilities across the sample size by their CVSS. So, and there's some circumstances where we find that there's only one vulnerability affecting thousands of systems. So we can address or remediate 1,000 findings with a single patch scenario or patch installation. So those are just some examples of leveraging that quantitative data to support remediation. Finally, the third way really speaks to the fundamental of conducting an SRA, which is to ensure that if you're performing an SRA, you're doing it holistically. You're looking at those three components, those three categories of control we've discussed at length during this presentation: administrative controls, technical controls, and physical controls. And really the benefit here, if not already obvious, is merely that they're all interconnected and codependent on each other. And I'll give an illustration of that here. An example where a patch management breakdown is linked across the administrative, physical, and technical controls. In the example scenario, we find that there's no explicit governance or ownership for patching for nursing stations at a recently acquired independent practice, a satellite facility. And as a result, no one's really responsible for patching those systems. As a result, it turns out during our analysis from a technical angle, we find that there's a known compatibility issue with our antivirus solution with existing out-of-date versions of Windows on that nursing station. When we conduct the physical component of our SRA, we find that those exact nursing stations have been maneuvered into patient waiting areas to handle increased volume. And as a result, it has been left unattended and a bored patient is surfing the web and they get hit with a drive-by download. You can see how this downstream effect really ties together all of those control categories, and it underpins or underlines rather the importance of ensuring that your SRA activities are holistic in nature and consider all of those categories.
Now, after completing your security risk assessment, you will have a clearer picture of your organization's risks and vulnerabilities. But the road to strengthening your organization's security posture does not stop there. The worst thing you can do is complete a security risk assessment, take the results, and put them aside. You may have fulfilled the requirement for performing an assessment, but you do not want to let those identified risks remain unaddressed. It's important to decide where to prioritize your remediation efforts. Organizations should first consider the availability of resources they have to address the identified risks. Where to allocate resources is entirely up to you and your team. The security risk assessment may have identified a large amount of vulnerabilities involving the security of your network, for instance, but without the expertise and available team to address those vulnerabilities, it's better to target areas which you can address more easily while still reducing overall risk. One way to do this is to develop corrective action plans and delineate responsibilities accordingly. This will help ensure that your organization is continuously working to reduce the overall risk. So today we talked about a bunch of different ways for focusing and improving your security risk assessment. Now, in the next 2 minutes, I'll try to quickly summarize everything we discussed today. So performing a focused security risk assessment, in this case regarding remote access security, is an effective mechanism for conducting a deep dive on a particular business area that can achieve a faster completion when most needed. FSRAs can be performed for various other aspects of the organization as well. Examples include things like incident response, breach notification, disaster recovery testing, and maybe even physical penetration testing. Today, we also talked about how you can take your existing security risk assessment process to the next level by utilizing frameworks, adding a numerical value to your assessment by integrating scoring and tiering, and also by performing a holistic assessment, which involves conducting technical scans, physical in-person walkthroughs, and detailed policy reviews. By either focusing or upgrading your annual security risk assessment, your organization's cybersecurity posture will continuously evolve and enhance, as well as reduce overall risk to information assets, while strengthening the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of sensitive information.
I hope everyone enjoyed the information that we covered today. And with that, I'll hand it off to Siobhan to talk about how you can learn more about what we discussed and learn about our upcoming events and also moderate some Q&A.
Thanks, Harrison and Ian. It's great information. Let's move into the Q&A. We did get a couple of questions. If anybody else has any questions and they want to chat us to them at the bottom of their screen, we can get them and answer them. The first one we have is, how do you square a focused assessment with a comprehensive assessment? This is probably for you, Ian. The two would seem to be at odds in some ways. In addition, have you incorporated OCR's guidance on risk assessments into your FSRA recommendations?
Right, that's a great question. So I'll speak to the first half. How do you correlate or how do you complement your standard SRA with FSRA findings? I think this speaks back to that visual earlier where I talked about that annual SRA coming around after that FSRA had been completed. Now, during the FSRA, when you accumulate and identify different risks, vulnerabilities, I anticipate you're leveraging some kind of risk register, risk management platform to house all of those things. So the risks associated with that FSRA activity will ultimately commingle with the same risks and vulnerabilities associated with your conventional SRA activities. And when you do get to that standardized SRA event, you're able to pull into scope some of the changes or remediation efforts applied to those original findings to understand if there's any discrepancy that's occurred between the original FSRA and the standardized annual SRA that you performed after the fact. You know, not only evaluating any changes or anything that was left unaddressed, also examining the extent of remediation accomplished, or really reevaluating what you already have established to see if anything has changed, either circumstantially or in the environment or in the technology that might facilitate it. As for the second component, some of the OCR guidance that has come out speaks specifically to things like discretion, enforcement discretion on the use of telehealth, for one example, as well as scenarios where care providers have to expose some patient information without going through the normal proper channels. Certainly, I can't speak specifically now on how best to apply that to the remote access scenario. Obviously, there's been some verbiage coming out about telehealth, also Zoom in some circumstances, and that discretion can certainly be considered and included in your own FSRA process. And I would say that I'd like to follow up with you and re-examine some of the materials available and give you a more in-depth answer about how you could apply that to your FSRA.
That's great, thank you. Okay, here's another one. This is, the question is, this could be a little off topic. Are there any updates coming from the feds or Congress on HIPAA high-tech CFFR 45 security and privacy rules? I'm not sure if that's something you can answer now. You guys want to follow up on that?
I think that's something we should follow up on.
Yeah, we'll probably follow up on that. I don't know, Harrison, if you've read anything recently that speaks directly to changing the existing content of the HIPAA security rule. I don't believe that there's been anything officially suggested or that's currently making its way through the government, certainly not in the wake of coronavirus, but it may be the case. Again, I would say we'd love to review some of the materials and get back to you with a more direct and specific answer. But I still think that was a great question and not at all off topic.
And I also got from somebody else telling me that they're going to be continual updates and guidance, and we should look at the HHS website. So we can take a look at that, and I know Ian and Harrison can follow up as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, so one more question. At my company, our remote workers have laptops issued by our IT department that we control, and they connect to our network using a VPN client. Are there any security issues specific to this technology we should look at for evaluating this? From our angle, it is a pretty buttoned up deployment.
I can take this one as well. Yeah, that's a very common, I think I alluded to that previously, it's a very common environment or solution to leverage is that endpoint client that facilitates VPN access. And in your example, I believe you mentioned that you have those company provided devices over which you have a lot of control for their security configurations, et cetera. There's a specific example I've come across I could speak to illustrate where there's still that security concern there. I worked with an organization that was leveraging a specific endpoint VPN client. I believe it was Cisco AnyConnect, and they were leveraging that on their workplace provided devices to connect to the organization's VPN. One thing that the IT administrators didn't account for, however, was that it was possible for end users to install that same client and copy the configurations on how to connect to the VPN onto their home computers, which ended up in a circumstance or ended up with a scenario where their employees were using their home PCs and their home MacBooks to connect directly to the internal VPNs because they weren't doing device-based authentication or their network access control policies weren't strong enough to compensate for that aberration. So I think that's a great example of how a lot of companies are probably doing it, and I think that is one illustration, a personal experience where one would need to make sure that they're accounting for that device level authentication or there's some other mitigating control that prevents their workforce members from circumventing the expected use of that technology.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Harrison, this one probably is your area. How do I determine which framework to utilize in performing a security risk assessment, or rather, how do I know I am utilizing a framework which is the best fit for my organization?
Yeah, no, that's right up my alley. It's a great question. So it's kind of difficult. Not like all standards and not all frameworks are very like one size fits all. So in reality, when choosing a framework, you really have to take in like a whole bunch of different factors, such as your company size, the nature of the company, the culture, as well as like any demands from stakeholders, from regulators, from shareholders, that kind of thing. So like really the primary goal of this exercise of performing a framework is to maximize the likelihood that your organization will achieve its set objectives. It's also important to identify like key criteria for selecting a framework and just kind of ensure that the framework aligns with your strategic like objectives. It's important also to consider as well as like your customer base. So for example, more and more healthcare organizations are requiring third parties to be HITRUST certified because the certificate shows that the third party has really gone above and beyond to try to establish information security protections. So when it comes to really identifying and choosing a framework, it's really important to look internally and find the one that best suits you. A lot of organizations or look towards like NIST, for example. The NIST cybersecurity framework is one of those industry-leading frameworks because it provides a very general view of organizational cybersecurity posture. So that's a good one to start with, but then there are also various other ones like we talked about today, where it's like the risk management framework, or if you want to take like a privacy approach, it's a great place to start is with NIST.
Okay, thanks. And I have one more. I'm not sure who this is best for. Do you think it's reasonable for us to ask our remote users to turn off their Alexa and other Internet of Things devices to safeguard privacy?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't quite catch it.
Sure. Sorry, I was probably reading too fast. Do you think it's reasonable for us to ask our remote users to turn off their Alexa and other IoT devices to safeguard privacy?
That's a really good question, and I think that I'll speak to it, and maybe Harrison, you can weigh in a little bit if you'd like as well. You know, I know firsthand that healthcare providers are actually leveraging Alexa devices in patient rooms where they're certainly going to be exposed to, you know, verbal PHI. From that standpoint, I think that, you know, certainly there may be scenarios where the organizations, based on their own discretion, just have that extra safeguard just in case. We don't know how that data is really being handled. I would actually say, you know, if an organization doesn't want to take that risk or something weird to happen where they don't fully understand how Alexa might be monitoring that information, or if the end user accidentally activates it with a key phrase or something like that, I would say just on the safe side, it might actually be prudent to consider imposing that control on those workforce members. And I think, you know, this goes back to that education and awareness component. Implementing that control would be as easy as sending out an email or a bulletin that just says, hey, if you guys have an Alexa device or a Google, Hey Google device, maybe just turn that off. That's just what we want. And, you know, like I gave an example about that organization using them in patient rooms. Maybe they did some additional due diligence before they felt comfortable with that. But that's a good example where I don't think enough is known to make a determinable decision. So it's ultimately the discretion of the organization as to their tolerance for risk. And certainly you would be well within your role and your rights to kind of ask workforce members not to have those devices in the room if they're going to be verbally talking about a PHI.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I want to add to that, Ian, is it comes back to a few things we're talking about today, is the administrative and those physical controls. So one thing we mentioned that you can do is you can make your employees sign an AUP, or also can perform like a security checklist on their physical security environment. So just maybe adding something like that, like disabling Alexa devices or disabling those kind of IoT devices that could potentially listen into whatever kinds of conversations, PHI or not, involved. If you add those kind of statements to your AUP and then just send out like an updated one to your employees for them to review and sign, it could be another option as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions. Thank you guys both very much. We have some links here to, Ian wrote a great article on remote work in the age of COVID-19, which has some new information, some information that's on here. You can get that on our website. You can follow us on LinkedIn for any other, we post any new webinars we have coming up. We have one coming up in May 7th for HITRUST. We have another one on third-party risk management in June. So please join us, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. Bye.